Okay. I think it's recording now. All right, so we're going to continue where we stopped, and I created a new project. So we're going to start from scratch. I'm going to do void here, which is something that I did yesterday. And because we have void, I'm just going to do return, and I'm going to get rid of that comment. And in fact, I'm going to get rid of this also. So today, what we will be doing is we'll be talking about loops. We'll be talking about if statements. And also, we'll be talking about like conditions. These are used in loops and if statements. We'll be talking about conversions. So yeah, we'll be talking about some kind of basic topics and some very important ones like loops and if statements. And if we have time, maybe we can talk about kind of pointers and addresses. Although I have a feeling that this one will happen Monday. All right. So I'm gonna define a character. So I'm gonna say char my letter equals to A. Now, if you remember, I did say that when you define a character and when you wanna give it a value, you should use single quotes, not double quotes, and that's how you do it in C. And of course, I can print it. I can say print if the value of my letter is %C \n, comma, my letter. And if I hit play, it's going to print A. So that's just an example of something that we learned yesterday. Of course, I can print integers, I can print floats, and I'm going to be doing some of that today. The first thing that I want to talk about is conversion. So you can convert from one data type to another. And for example, let's say I have a float. Let's say I say float. My float is equal to, say, for example, 1.9. Of course, I can print that. I can say print if the value of my float is %, if \n. And then here, of course, I would have to say my float. And of course, I can do 0.2. We did some of that yesterday. And if I hit play, you will see it'll print 1.90. Now, let's say I want to convert this one to an integer. Now, you might think that we can do this. The integer value of my float is $d \n, my float. So maybe you're going to think that, how about we use my float, which is a float data type, and to print it, we would use $d, which is a decimal, which is really a base 10 integer. But that really doesn't work because this is a float. It's a float data type. And this is used for an integer data type. So that cannot be done. What you would have to do is you would have to convert this one to an integer and probably put it in an integer variable and then use that variable. I mean, that's one way to do it. So for example, you can say int, you can say my int, or let's say my converted float to int. Of course, that's not a typical variable name, but at least you were being descriptive. Essentially, I want to convert my float to an integer and I want to put it in this variable. So for you to do that, you would have to do the following. This is the syntax. It looks actually a little odd, but it's not that complicated. We'll get used to it. So this is how it looks like. So instead of doing something in Python, by the way, in Python, to convert a float to an integer, we would do this kind of int and then my float. We do this. Let me do this. Yeah, I can also do this. So that can be done in Python. So in Python, you can actually say my float equals to 1.5 or 1.4, and you can say my, converted float to int is going to be the integer of my float. You can do that. Now, if you remember what you studied in Python, this one is it's not gonna round it. It'll actually truncate everything to the right of the decimal point. So even if you had something that looks like this, 1.8, because it's gonna truncate everything to the right of the decimal point, you're gonna actually end up with 1. So you're not gonna end up with 2. So it's not really rounding. In Python, you can do kind of round. And in many languages like C or Java, you can also round. But if you just take a float and convert it to an integer, you're essentially truncating everything to the right of the decimal point. So the same thing happens here. So you can say, I want the integer of this value, my float, and that will give you 1. So all of this highlighted section will be replaced with 1. And 1 is going to be assigned to this variable. And of course, if you print it here, it'll print 1. Let me hide this. Let me hit play. So you can see here it printed 1 when we converted 1.9 to an integer. All right. So I'm gonna start something new here and I'm gonna do return. Again, if you remember from yesterday, we can have as many returns as we want, and return is gonna quit the function. And essentially it's a way for us to skip all of that instead of commenting it. Although I can comment it easily because I'm using the command / I'm just going to keep it, and this return is going to quit the function. So it's almost as if all of this is commented. All right. So I'm going to do a few more examples, kind of similar to what we're doing here. We're just talking about some basics of C, and these kind of concepts are actually similar in other languages too. Here's one that's also similar, which is dividing. If you divide two integers, in many languages, the answer is going to be an integer. So let's say, for example, int result equals to, for example, 10 divided by 3. So 10 divided by 3, if you kind of put that in a calculator, it'll give you kind of 3.333. However, because you're putting the result in an integer, in fact, let me take that back. It's not before that. It's not because you're putting the result in an integer. It's because you have an integer divided by an integer. And that's actually different than this part. So let's take a look at this part, and I'll show you an example where kind of what I'm saying will make hopefully more sense. But when you take an integer here, 10 is an integer. If you just do 10, it'll be an integer. If you do 10.0, that's going to be a float. It's going to be a float that contains the value 10. But if you don't have the 0.0, if you have just that, then it'll be an integer. And you have an integer divided by an integer. And when you divide an integer by an integer, the result has to be an integer. And because of that, the 3.333 will be truncated, and you will end up with 3. Now, I'm going to print that, and I'm going to show you that this is the case. I'm going to say the value of result is $d\n, comma result. And if I hit play, it's going to print 3. Now, if I change this to a float, and if I change this percent sign D to percent sign F, and if I change this to 0.2, what do you think the answer is going to be? If I hit play here, what do you think the answer is going to be? Can someone guess?
Assuming that I would be tempted to say because you're telling it to return a float that it would do that. However, wait, no, since we redefined the result as float, I would think it would return it as a float.
So you think it's going to print maybe 3.33?
Yeah, I would think so.
Okay, so that's one answer. Okay, it seems that there's a consensus here that the answer is going to be 3.33. Now, of course, I can play and I can show you what the answer is going to be. But maybe I should tell you before that it shouldn't be, or it's not going to be 3.33. Because remember, when you're dividing an integer by an integer, the result has to be an integer. So before we actually take the result and put it in a variable, we're going to have the 0.33 truncated. So typically what happens when you have something that looks like this, the right-hand side gets evaluated and then it gets assigned to the left-hand side in this case. Now, when 10 divided by 3 is evaluated, that's actually going to give you 3. So you're going to lose the 0.33 here. And even though you're going to put it in a float, it's almost like putting a 3 in a float. So you're going to end up with 3.00 because that's the float version of a 3. Now, the guess that you made is not bad. 3.33 is it's a guess that it's not a bad guess. But it's not the correct answer because, yeah, we would lose the 0.33 here. And hopefully kind of that made sense. Of course, we can play and you will see that it's going to print 3.00. Do you see what happened here? And that's because we lost the 0.33 here. So the reason why we lose the 0.33 is because we're dividing an integer by an integer. Can we make one of these two numbers a float? I think I may have shown you this very briefly a few minutes ago. Do you remember what I did to make one of those a float?
You just said 0.0.
Exactly. So if I can make this 10, 10.0. I can make the 3, 3.0. I can just make one of them a float. And right now, because we have a float divided by integer, the value is going to be 3.33, and that's going to be stored here. And that's what's going to be printed. So you can see here, that's what's printed. There's another way to do it, a way similar to what you've seen here. We can actually convert the 10 to a float by doing this. So if you do this, essentially what you're saying is, instead of taking the 10 and divided by 3, let's use the float version of 10, which is 10.0, and let's divide that by 3. And because when you do that, you're not doing integer division, you're going to end up with 3.33. It's the same thing. Now, of course, if you have an integer here, if I say integer result, and then I have %d here, what do you think that's going to print?
Wait, can you ask that again?
The question is, if you notice, what I did is there was a float here, and I replaced that with an int, and I'm keeping this division, which is the float version of 10 divided by 3. And of course, because this is an int, I have to do %d here. And my question is, what would that print?
There's 3.
That's right. It's going to print 3, even though this will actually result in a 3.33. But when you try to put it in an int, you're going to lose the 0.33. So you would end up with only 3, and that's what gets printed. All right. Do you have any questions about this? If you don't have any questions, we can start with if, then we can do the loops. And again, if we have time, we'll do this. But let me do this here. Okay, we can start with if statements. I'm going to do return here. So in Python, I like to kind of always mention Python because I know you have taken Python, and that's maybe the only language that you've taken, because Java, which is CSCI 221, is not a prerequisite of this one. It's I believe a co-requisite. I would have to look at the syllabus again. I haven't taught this course in a year, but I think it's a co-requisite. So maybe some of you are taking it right now, although it's very unlikely because this is the second summer. Let me ask you this, and maybe you can thumbs up or thumbs down. Have you taken Java? Which is, yeah, okay. Java is 221, yeah. Have you taken Java? Okay, all right, so, okay, all right. So we can just talk about Python, and as you're learning Java, you will realize that C is actually similar to Java, much similar to Java than it is similar to Python. So in Python, we have a specific loop, and it looks like this 4-element in, and here usually we have a list, and then we would kind of print element, or maybe, accumulate element, or maybe, do something with element. But typically that's how we write loops in Python. And it's a nice syntax. I like it. It makes sense. It's easy. It's kind of concise. In C and in Java, it's actually different. But this is the loop. I did say I want to start with if statements. So let me start with if statements. In Python, it looks like this. You have an if, and then you have a condition that looks like, for example, num is less than 10. You have a colon, and your if body is everything that's indented. So here, for example, line 1, if that's indented, then that would be of, let's say, of if body, and of course, as soon as you stop the indentation, line 3 outside of the if body. And of course, you may have an else, right? Do you remember this? You would have a colon here, and you would say line, 1 of the else body, line 2 of the else body, And let's call this line 1 of what's outside of the if body, if else body. So when the code executes, if this condition is true, we're going to do these 2 lines. And then we're going to skip the else and we're going to go here. If this condition is false, we're going to go to the else, do these 2 lines, and then get to here. That's how it works. So in C, it's actually similar. So we would say if, and there's a condition here. And the difference here between Python and C, first of all, you do need the parentheses in C. So your condition has to be inside. Let's say, for example, int num equals to 10. And here I'm going to say if num is less than 20, that's a condition. So this will be evaluated to either true or false. If it's true, I'm going to go to the if body, which is here. I'm going to say this is the if body. And maybe I can say num is equal to num plus 50. Now this is, of course, the else body. This is the else body. And I can say num equals to num minus 50. This is just kind of a silly example, doesn't do much, but hopefully it conveys the logic of if statements. If I were to print the value of num, what do you think that will be? Looking at this code and knowing, the logic and the reasoning behind, what we have here, what do you think the value of num will be?
60.
60. So we start with 10. Because 10 is less than 20, we're going to add 50. That's going to be 60. That's right. Let me hit play. Oops, I forgot the semicolon. Okay, that's 60. So that hopefully was straightforward. We have an and we have an or, and we have a not. These are logical operators similar to the ones you've seen in Python. Hopefully you've seen some of them. So I can say if num is less than 20 and, this is how and looks like in C, and num is greater than 10. So if it's between 10 and 20, then do this. Now, of course, 10 is not between 10 and 20. Because of that, we're going to get to the else. We're going to subtract 40 from the 10. We end up with negative 30. And that's what should be printed. This is the and. We can have an or, and an or looks like this. In this case, of course, this one would be true, and this one will be false. But because we have an or here, if one of them is true, the whole condition will be true. And because of that, we're going to go inside the if body, and we're going to end up printing 60. All right, I think we're making good progress. I'm going to go to the for loops, and then we can do the while loops. In fact, maybe we can do the while loops first. But I'm going to actually have a return here. I think that's it for the if statements. If you have any questions, again, feel free to ask your question either in the chat window or you can unmute yourself. So the while actually looks very similar to the if, except that we go to the beginning by default. So it looks like this. We have a while and we have the parentheses as well. And we can say num is less than 20. And I'm going to actually take this num, I'm going to steal it and put it at the beginning, because if I want to use num here, it has to be declared prior to this line. And here I'm going to also have those curly braces. So the curly braces can look like this or can look like this. This one looks better. It looks kind of more aligned. And because of that, many people like this notation. But this one is more compact. And a lot of people like this one. In fact, most people like this notation, even though they're not really aligned. But the fact that you save a single line here, it's actually pretty popular. I have to say, I used to dislike this. I used to always like to do it like this, but right now, I think I prefer to do this. Yeah, so it does take some time to get used to this notation. But let's do something, let's do that. This is maybe more readable. And here I'm gonna do something. I'm gonna say print if the value of num is %d \n comma num. Who wants to tell me, and let's make this 5. And let's make this, in fact, let's make this 5, and let's make this greater than 0. And what is that gonna print? Anybody wants to guess? Like it's gonna print the value of num, or let me even simplify it more. Let me say
Continually?
just, what's that?
It'll just print 5 continually.
Continually, like it'll just go in an infinite loop. That's right. This actually will be an infinite loop because num will continue to be more than 0. We're not changing num, so that'll be an infinite loop. That's right. What we should do, of course, if we don't want to do an infinite loop, we need to either increment or decrement num. In this case, you do want to decrement it. So you want to say num equals to num minus 1. So in this case, what is it going to print? In fact, let me simplify this, which is what I was going to do. And let me say hello here. And the question is, how many hellos is it going to print?
Five.
5. That's exactly right. So if I hit play, it's going to print hello 5 times. You can see here, this is 5. And I can even do %d with a closing parentheses. And of course, I need to do comma, num, and you will see it'll print 5, hello, 4, hello, 3, hello, 2, hello, 1, hello. That's it. That's what it's printing. So you can do this, you can use this notation. There's another notation that you can use that you can also use in Python that looks like this. Num minus equals to 1, which really means the same thing. This means num equals to num minus 1. That's another kind of notation that I didn't like. But once you get used to it, you actually like, I mean, people tend to like it because it's compact. And of course you can do 2 like this, and that's going to subtract 2's. So this one's going to be minus 2. Let me have another comment here that says this is going to be that, and this one's going to be 2. Yeah. So in this case, it's going to print 5 hello, 3 hello, 1 hello, and that's it. So this is the while. And now we're going to talk about the for. So the for is actually very different than the for in Python. So the while in C is actually similar to the while in Python. The only difference is while in Python would look like this, and you wouldn't have this, those square curly braces. And those actually you don't see in Python. Those are used in the formatted strings. We've seen that actually yesterday, but you don't see them a lot, those curly braces in Python. All right, so let's do the for. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the template by Xcode. So if you type for, and if you hit enter here, it'll actually give you kind of a template. And I think this template is going to be good for us to learn kind of how for loops work in C. So we have something called initialization. We have something called condition. We have increment or decrement, and we have statements. So initialization is when you give your control variable an initial value. So in this loop, this num variable is usually referred to by control variable. So this is usually referred to by control variable because it controls the loop. So this num controls the loop because it's part of the condition here. So in the initialization, usually you give your control variable a value. So I'm going to say int. I'm not going to use num anymore. Let me just say control variable. And here I'm going to say control variable equals to 0. So this is essentially the initialization. And the condition, this is the condition that's going to determine whether we're going to go and execute those statements or not. So here I'm going to say something like control variable is less than 5. So if this condition is true, then I'm going to execute everything here. And let's make this statement printf I am inside the loop, and then I'm going to say the value of control variable is %d\n, comma control variable. Now, after I execute the body of the loop, then I go to the increment. And increment should change the control variable. If it doesn't change the control variable, then we're going to have an infinite loop. So this one would be something like control variable equals to control variable plus 1. Now, it's actually more common to do control variable plus plus. We can do that. And in this case, in the context of for loops, this would mean control variable equals to control variable plus 1. I think we have to remember that this notation, this syntax plus plus, is typically only used in for loops, and we need to be kind of careful when we decide to use it outside of the for loops. You can actually use the syntax outside of the for loops, but it can be tricky. We need to talk about this more. So I would recommend that we don't use the syntax outside of the for loop. If you want to add one, the best way to do it would be, how I showed you, either saying num equals to num plus 1 or saying num plus equals to 1. And here, of course, you can do exactly that. You can say control variable is equal to control variable plus 1 if you want, or you can say control variable plus equals to 1, or you can say control variable plus plus in this case, because we're inside the for loop, or this is for loop, right? This is part of the for loop syntax. So if you do this, it's going to print, I'm inside the loop, the value of the control variable is 0. Then it's going to print, I'm inside the loop, the value of control variable is 1. Then it'll say 2, 3, 4, and that's it. When it gets to 5, when we increment the control variable, and when the control variable becomes 5, the condition is going to become false, and we're not going to execute what's in the loop. So just to kind of recap, we start here. This initialization executes only once. So let me write this down. The initialization step or part executes only once. Then we go to the condition. If it's true, we execute the loop body. In this case, the printf statement. After we execute the loop body, we go to the increment or decrement part, and that would be this one. And of course, we increment or decrement. This could be minus minus, that would be the decrement. After decrementing, incrementing, or decrementing, we go to the condition again. We essentially execute or evaluate the condition again, and we repeat and repeat. Of course, repeat means if the condition is true, execute loop body. If condition is false, quit loop. Let me just do that. Yeah. So here we're going to start here with the initialization. Then we go to the condition. The condition is true, so execute everything in the loop body. And then we go to the increment. So 0 is going to become 1. And we're going to say, is 1 less than 5? The answer is yes. So we execute the body. Then we go to the increment. Control variable is going to become 2. Is 2 less than 5? We execute the loop body. We keep doing that until control variable becomes 5. And 5 less than 5 is going to give us false. And that's when we quit the loop. So if I hit play here, you'll see it'll print it 5 times from 0 to 4. Let me pause here for a few seconds and see if anybody has any questions about this. All right. So let's talk about 2 commands that are used in for loops or even while loops. And they're actually used in Python, but they're not used they're not used often. In fact, some books recommend that they're not used, that they shouldn't be used. I personally use them, and I think there are cases where, it's good to use them. because of that, we're going to cover them. And yeah, if you decide to never use them, that's okay. But it's good to know them. These are called continue and break. So I'm going to actually have a return here. I'm going to create another loop. So I'm going to say int, let me say var equals to 0 for, I'm going to use the template. And that's going to be var equals to 0. So actually, I'm just going to do var. And this var is less than 5, var plus plus, and print if var value of var is %d \n comma var. So it's actually very similar to what we had here. So one thing that I should mention, it's actually possible to do this. It's allowed in Xcode to do this, where you would not only initialize, but also declare the control variable. I don't like to do that. Some compilers, some versions of C compilers will not let you do that. Because of that, I'm going to just say int var, and I'm going to just give it the value here. All right, so continue is gonna continue will mean go back to the, or go to the increment. So skip everything after continue and go to the increment and continue this kind of loop. And break is going to quit the loop. So here I can say, for example, if var is equal to 2, break. Now notice one thing here that I did that I haven't mentioned. Because the body of the if is a single line, I didn't need to use the curly braces. So in the past here, when I showed you if statements and whiles, I used curly braces, but I really didn't have to use curly braces here because this was just a single line. And here also it's a single line. Of course, with the comment, it makes it kind of more complicated because does the comment count? And the answer is it probably does count. So you probably cannot do this, can you? Actually, you probably can. So I guess the comment doesn't count. So you could potentially remove those curly braces. And that's what I'm doing here because it's a single line. I'm going to keep them for now just to, I think, just to prevent confusion. And once we're more familiar with this, we can start removing them. So break is going to quit the loop, essentially exit the loop, not the function, just the loop. And continue is going to go to the increment, decrement part and continue the pattern that I outlined here. All right, so if you were to look at this code, what do you think will be printed based on this definition of break?
The value of the variable is whatever the variable value is. It will do it for 0. It will do it for increment 1, and then at increment 2, it will exit the loop.
So it's going to print 0, 1, 2.
No, when it hits 2, it exits the loop. So it'll only print 0 and 1.
Okay. Is that your final answer? Do you want to think about it more? Do you think that's what's going to happen?
No, actually, it will print 2 because the break is after the print statement.
Exactly. So it will print 2 because of exactly what you said. The break is after the print statement. So we can try it. 0, 1, 2. So how about if I continue? And maybe I should say if var is equal to 2 or var is equal to 0. So I'm saying if var is equal to 2 and var is equal to 0, continue, which means go to here Let me make a change here just to make it a better question. Let me do this. So if var is equal to 2 or var is equal to 0, then I'm going to continue, which means go to the increment decrement and then continue the loop. So what do you think that's going to print? Think about that for a minute.
It would be the same as if you didn't put that. It would print 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Because you're still just incrementing.
It's true, but continue is going to kind of skip everything below, and it's going to, it's
I
almost
get it.
like, yeah.
Prints, yeah.
So in this case, what do you think that'll print?
It should print lines 1, 3, 4, 5.
Close. It's not going to print 5, but
Yeah,
it
1.
will print, yeah, it will print 1, 3, 4. So that is good. I mean, I think you got it. And you're going to see questions that look like this in the quiz on Monday. So it's good that we're doing some of that. So this is the continue. We did see the break. And these are used in loops. You can use them in Python. You can use them in Java. Again, some people don't think that they should be used or abused, but I think it's good to learn them, and it's good to use them. If you feel that you need to use them, that's okay.